Okay, I want to welcome you here to Olive Shoot Ministries, and this message is going to be about Sukkot. We are a ministry that believes in honoring the Sabbath and honoring the appointed times, the festivals of Yahweh. Too many people are falling into a trap of ignoring His Word. Olive Shoot Ministries is a ministry that seeks to draw people back to His Word. So I want to welcome you here. I want to thank you. We'll get started with Sukkot. Turn to Deuteronomy 16. This is where we're going to start. Deuteronomy 16. It's going to be 13 through 22. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to start from the back and work forward. It's going to be a little different. If you don't mind, follow along with me. Perform the festival of Sukkot for 7 days after the ingathering from your threshing floor, from your winepress, and you shall rejoice in your festival. You and your son and your daughter and your male servant and your female servant and the Levite and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates. For 7 days you shall celebrate to Yahweh your Elohim in the place which Yahweh chooses. Because Yahweh your Elohim does bless you in all your increase and in all the work of your hands, and you shall be only rejoicing. 3 times a year all your males appear before Yahweh your Elohim in the place which He chooses. The festival of Matzot, and at the festival of Shavuot, and at the festival of Sukkot. And none shall appear before Yahweh empty-handed, but each one with the gift of his hand according to the blessing of Yahweh your Elohim, which He has given you. Appoint judges and officers within your gates, which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous right ruling. Do not distort right ruling. Do not show partiality, nor take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. Follow righteousness, righteousness alone, so that you live and inherit the land which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you. Do not plant for yourself any tree as an Asherah near the slaughter place of Yahweh your Elohim that you make for yourself, and do not set up a pillar which Yahweh your Elohim hates. I'm going to start with the last 2 verses, 21 and 22. In the Septuagint it says, you will not plant a grove of timber beside the altar of Yahweh your sovereign one, which you will make for yourselves, or an Asherah pole. And 22, and you will not erect for yourselves a memorial stone pillar, which Yahweh your sovereign hates. In Deuteronomy 12, Yahweh told Israel that when they, if you want to turn to us, Deuteronomy 12, 29 through 32. He says that you will guard for yourself, in verse 30, not, that's the nation that they were going in there and they were going to dispossess, which means they were going to take their lands and run them off. It's not inherit, the word means to dispossess, to take as a possession, to take it from them. Yahweh gave it to them, to Israel, and they were going to take it from them. It says that you guard for yourself that you are not ensnared to follow after they are destroyed from before you, and that you do not inquire about their mighty ones. Their mighty ones were their deities that they worship, saying, how did these nations serve their mighty ones, or worship their gods? Let me do so too. Do not do so to Yahweh your Elohim, for every abomination which Yahweh hates they have done to their mighty ones, for they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their mighty ones. All the words I am commanding you, guard to do it. Do not add to it, nor take away from it. All right. This is probably a message that not too many people are going to really enjoy or are going to like, but it reminds me of when I went to Maine to preach at a Baptist church, and the sermon was on Pesach, Passover. And during that time, I showed how Easter is a pagan festival. And it is. It's very pagan. But how about our traditions? I mean, how much of our traditional holidays are rooted in paganism? I mean, have you ever considered that they're rooted in paganism? Not many people have. Now, if you look at it, Christmas, we all know Christmas is rooted in paganism. Even Christ Mass, which is Christmas, means death of the Messiah. I mean, it celebrates a death or death to him. And the birthday is that they equate to Yeshua is the birth date of Tammuz. I mean, that is any history you can find, any encyclopedia. You can read that anywhere. Easter, we all know Easter has nothing to do with the resurrection. It's also worshiping Asherah, Ishtar, Esther, Eoster, whichever name you want to give it. It's Babylonian. It goes back to Semiramis, but it's a Babylonian deity that they worship, a fertility deity that they did a lot of immorality with. And that's where you get this Asherah pole. The verses 21 and 22 says, don't make for yourself any tree or an Asherah pole near the altar. What they would do is, in the Septuagint it says grove. Some of the things that they would do is they would plant a grove of trees, and they would have an altar set up where they do sacrifices, and they would practice immorality around their sacrifices. And Shaul writes in Corinthians and talks about the wreath and running the race, because he talks about they run a race for the wreath that is corruptible. And one of the things about that is, in Corinth, and also whenever they would do the Olympics, which everybody watches the Olympics, but that's pagan to the core too. But they would go and they would take in Corinth, because they had a game that was actually almost more popular than the Olympics themselves. And there, since it was a town, a seaboard town, they had a grove set up to Poseidon. And whenever they would run in that race, they would go to that grove and they would take some of the limbs and they would weave it together into a wreath or a crown. And the person would run, and whoever won got that crown that came from that grove that was to Poseidon. And that was what they ran for. They didn't run for fame or fortune. They ran because they could get that crown that was to a deity, showing themselves worthy of that deity's eyes in that town. That's what they did. The Olympics, everybody watches the Olympics where they run with a torch and they run up there to this big old thing and they light it. That's the way they carried the light from Zeus to light on his altar. There was an altar to Zeus for the Olympics that they would run in the Olympics. They're still doing the exact same thing today. And the same thing is with all these holidays that we have. Now, what about Thanksgiving? Have you ever thought about Thanksgiving being pagan? People argue that Thanksgiving is not pagan. They say that when someone starts saying that, well, Thanksgiving's pagan, they consider you a nut job and a heretic and kind of push you aside, because it doesn't fall on any day that was celebrated by the pagans during the harvest time. There's no day, the day that it falls on, which is the fourth Thursday in the month, is not on one of these days. But there's a reason for that. And if you want to go back as far as Thanksgiving itself being a holiday in America, it was not considered a holiday until 1941. The Congress was the event, actually, that they declared Thanksgiving as a national holiday. Get off. Every year you get Thanksgiving off. But the person that was behind this was a woman by the name of Sarah Hale back in the 1800s, late 1800s to early 1900s. And in 1859, this is one of her prayers. She prayed, and I'm going to read it. Dear Lord, our God and Savior, that the American people shall have an annual Thanksgiving festival after the ingathering of their harvest is now a settled matter. Every state and territory has in some way signified its willingness to adopt this venerable custom, which we recognize in the Jewish Feast of Weeks as appointed by Jehovah for his chosen people. She equated Thanksgiving with the Jewish Feast of Weeks. She was kind of off on her feast, this Feast of Tabernacles, which was also known as the Feast of Ingathering, the Festival of Ingathering. That's one of the names for Sukkot, is Festival of Ingathering. So what about Thanksgiving? She pestered and persisted in trying to get it as a holiday. She also was one of the ones that wrote a very famous poem that we all teach our little kids, and it's in the schools. Mary, Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow. She's the one that wrote that. She was a well-known woman. She had wrote for all the magazines, and she was the editor-in-chief for two women's magazines, and she wrote several these books, these little poems for kids, and she also pestered Abraham Lincoln, who was one of the first presidents to try to get this as a national holiday and proclaim it as the fourth Thursday in November. That's how it came to be on the fourth Thursday in November. Not that it was a pagan festival. She wanted that date. And the reason she wanted that date was that she wanted people, after they got all the farming done, after they got all their trips, that they would be at home and they would be able to celebrate. I mean, you're there with your family, you're having a feast. But there's one thing that has happened, especially with this feast of ingathering, the harvest feast of Sukkot. In Leviticus, Yahweh says, if you want to look at Leviticus 23, and this is important. Leviticus 23, 1 and 2. And Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The appointed time of Yahweh, which you are to proclaim as set-apart gatherings. My appointed times are these. Whose appointed time of gathering in the Scripture are they? Are they Israel, or are they Yahweh? They're Yahweh. And what happens is, this time it's Sukkot. It's the Feast of Ingathering. It's the Feast of the Harvest. This is where they would, they had a celebration. It's His appointed time, and they would get together at the end of their harvest, and when they would bring their harvest in. And this is one of the things that was done then. The males, according to Deuteronomy 30, I think it's 30 to 31, 31, all the males were to come up at that time. And even right here in verse 16, 3 times a year. Matzah, which is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Shavuot, Feast of Weeks, and Sukkot. They were to come up mandatory at these times. And they were not to come up empty-handed. There's a whole bunch of traditions that we'll get into in just a little bit, temporarily, not real far. But what happened is, Sukkot was a Feast of Ingathering. It was mandatory for them to go up to Jerusalem, where Yahweh causes His name to dwell, like what you see, wherever the place which Yahweh chooses, because Yahweh your Elohim does bless you, there's a place that He was going to choose. Israel had been wandering around in the desert for 40 years, going to the land the first time. So they wandered around. He gave the appointed times. He was teaching them how they were to honor those appointed times all the time that they were wandering around the desert. They were already given, but there's some of them that could not take place until they were inside the land. Sukkot is one of them that was to take place, choose it. And whenever He chose a place to place His name over, that was 3 times a year, all the males would go up there. And they would bring their families. And Sukkot is one of them. He chose His name to dwell in Jerusalem. And He also says that in Deuteronomy, wherever He chooses His name to dwell, you're not to sacrifice any other animals anywhere else. Not in your gate, not anywhere else. You're to sacrifice in Jerusalem. That's where you're to do it at. He calls His name to dwell in Jerusalem in 1 Kings. Turn over to 1 Kings. This is another one. 1 Kings 8. 1 Kings 8 is where the temple was built. In Samuel, and this is one of the important things when you start trying to understand how Yahweh became a man and how He's both the Son and He's also the Father. I mean, He is Messiah. In Samuel, David wanted to build a house to Yahweh. But Yahweh told him that He's not going to build that house because he was a man of bloodshed. He said, your son after you will build a house for me, and I will be to him, he'll be a son to me. Okay? This was, I think, pointing, in my opinion, it was pointing to Yeshua when He was coming, going to build a house. Solomon took it upon himself to build a house, but that was also something that was in the future too, that I believe Yahweh saw and temple, because Jerusalem was the where he was going to cause his name to dwell. And right here in chapter 8 of 1 Kings, we see that Solomon, during the Feast of Tabernacles, was dedicating this temple because it had been built. They'd been working on it. It's been built. And where verse 13 and verse 8 it says, I have built you an exalted house and established place for you to dwell forever. This is the temple, the first temple. But if you go back up to verse 9, it says, there was nothing in the ark, only the 2 tablets of stone which Moshe put there at Horeb, where Yahweh made a covenant with the children of Israel when they came out of the land of Mitzrayim. And it came to be when the priest came out of the set-apart place, and whenever it talks about the set-apart place, that's where they placed the ark. That is the most set-apart place that is covered by a veil. That is where the Ark of the Covenant was, which was, whenever they go into battle, they would carry that. That's where the cloud of his esteem, his honor, his code in the Hebrew, which means to be weighty, to honor, is the person's majesty, that it dwelt over the ark. That's the most set-apart place, and that's where the high priest only went in once a year. It says that the cloud filled the house of Yahweh. This is important. This is his house. So that the priests weren't able to stand and perform the services because of the cloud, for the esteem of Yahweh filled the house. Solomon said Yahweh had said he would dwell in the dark cloud. Now if you turn over just one page to verses 65 and 66, we see that Solomon at the time performed the festival. That's one of the names for Sukkot. It's not only known as the Feast of Ingathering or the Festival of Ingathering or Sukkot or the Feast of Tabernacles, but in the Mishnah and in the rabbinical writings and in some of the early writings, it is known simply as the festival because it's important. It was the festival, the major festival. In the Gospel of John, you see it called the festival or that great festival. That's the way what they called it. And in 65 it says, and Israel with him a great assembly from the entrance of Hamath to the Wadi of Mitzrayim before Yahweh our Elohim. 7 days and 7 days, 14 days total. And 8 days he sent the people away and they blessed the sovereign and went to their tent rejoicing and glad of heart for all the goodness that Yahweh had done for his servant Dawid and for Israel. They went to their tents on the 8th day rejoicing. He sent them away, rejoicing to their tent. This is important when you start dealing with Sukkot. Now, what does all this have to do with Thanksgiving? Thanksgiving is deceitful because it's a false harvest. Why is it a false harvest? Well, you see, Solomon, because he did not do what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, he messed up. And Yahweh said he's going to tear the kingdom away from him. And it was going to be divided. Jeroboam, who was one of the leaders there with Solomon, was going to take 10 kingdoms. Solomon was going to have Judah. And also Levi, or Levite, where the priests were because he was in Jerusalem. So 10 tribes, which was known as Israel, and the other 2 tribes, which was part of the tribe of Benjamin, Judah, were known as Judah. So that's where you get Jewish, because they stayed. The term Jewish actually comes from those that stayed there in Jerusalem instead of the 10 tribes that separated. Now Jeroboam knew that Yahweh had said that every male was to go up to where he causes his name to dwell. Right here we see in chapter 8, we see that Yahweh entered in there to his house, and his splendor and majesty, the cloud filled the temple. And that priest had to leave because he was there. That's his house. Solomon said, this is the house that's built for you to dwell forever. Jeroboam knew this. Jeroboam also knew the Old Testament. It's not like he didn't know. But one of the things, if you turn over to chapter 12, and this is why I'm going to hopefully show you that just because Thanksgiving doesn't fall on a pagan festival week, it is also has pagan influence and is deceptive and deceitful. If you go back up to 26 in 1 Kings 12, 26, you see that Jeroboam said in his heart, now the reign shall return to the house of Dawid. Why was it going to return to the house of Dawid? It says, if these people go up to do this slaughterings in the house of Yahweh, at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people shall turn back to their master, Rechavam, or Rehoboam, sovereign of Yehudah, and they shall kill me and go back to Rehoboam, sovereign of Yehudah. See, he knew where they were to go. He knew that they were to take and go up these 3 times a year, and he knew that the house of Yahweh was at Jerusalem. He also knew that Yahweh said, you don't slaughter anywhere except where I cause my name to dwell, nowhere else. So what did he do? He said in his heart that they're going to do this, so he made a decision. So the sovereign, Jeroboam, took counsel and made 2 calves of gold and said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. See your mighty ones, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Mitzrayim. Now what happened when Israel made 2 golden calves? And I think Aaron said, behold, your mighty ones. We're going to make a feast of Yahweh tomorrow. Did Yahweh like that? No, he got mad. Matter of fact, he told Moses to get out of his way because he was going to get on his, he was going to smite the people. 29, and he set up one in Beit El, and the other he put up in Dan. And this matter became a sin for the people. Went before the one as far as Dan. Now, they would go as far as Dan, but they wouldn't go up to Jerusalem, to the very house of Yahweh. And he made the house of high places, and he made priests of all sorts of people who were not of the sons of Levi. And Jeroboam performed a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival that was in Yehudah. And he offered on the slaughter place. So he did at Beit El, slaughtering to the calves that he had made. And at Beit El he appointed priests of the high places which he had made. And he made offerings on the slaughter place which he had made at Beit El on the 15th day of the 8th new month, on 8th new month, 8th month, in the month which he had devised in his own heart. And he performed a festival for the children of Israel to offer on the slaughter place and burn incense. This meant the Sukkot was in the 7th month on the 15th day, and it was the 8th day festival. And it was called the festival. Jeroboam knew that they would go up during ingathering, and everybody went up there because it was mandatory. And they would go up there and they would dwell in booths, because we see when we get into Leviticus 23, which details about Sukkot, it says that when you come up there for that ingathering, you're not to do any occupational work, and you're to celebrate this, and you're also to dwell in booths. That's one of the things that they were to do. They were to take, these, there was 4 species that we'll deal with in just a little bit, that they were to take with him. They're not to come up empty-handed. He knew this, so what he did was he set his date of a festival, a harvest festival, that was in contradiction to Yahweh. So, Thanksgiving. Has that been celebrated? They say, no, Thanksgiving has been celebrated throughout all this time. Well, one of the symbols is the cornucopia for Thanksgiving, the horn of plenty, which is a pagan symbol for Zeus. It's also a pagan symbol for Ceres, or Kerke, in Greek. Listen to some of this. The ancient Greek harvest festival was called Thesmophoria and celebrated Demeter, the founder and goddess of the harvest. The symbols of Demeter were poppies and ears of corn, a basket of fruit, and a little pig. The Roman goddess of the harvest, Ceres, or Ceres, from whom we get the word cereal, had a festival which occurred on October 4th and was called the Carelia. She was known as the Harvest Queen. Corn represents her as the Harvest Queen, or the new corn. Matter of fact, in England, they had an autumn festival called the Harvest Home, which was derived from the Druid harvest season. And Druids, if you've seen some of their stuff, it's satanic, it's cultic. They had a 3-day feast that began on a special service at the village church, which had been decorated on these occasions. Now, some of the things that they did in Peru, the Indians worshiped the Mother Maize. And I'm reading some of this, but you'll understand why. Sarah Hale, we think that the Pilgrims were the ones that started Thanksgiving. No, they thanked Yahweh for getting them safely into America. But the Indians also had a harvest feast and a festival, and what the Pilgrims and the Indians got together was during that feast, and they were having a show of force because they were showing them the muskets and trying to, show how strong they were, and also at this feast was at that time. This is not the first Thanksgiving. There were people before, and this is 1621, that people say that the Pilgrims started the first Thanksgiving in Turkey and all that. But no, there were people landed in Florida in the 1500s, and they had a Thanksgiving, and they celebrated thanking Yahweh for getting them there safely. In Virginia, before 1621, I think was in the late 1500s, they did the same thing, 1607. So, I mean, there's several different places on the East Coast that they had Puritans and Pilgrims that came over that celebrated and had a feast to Yahweh for bringing them there safely. But it wasn't during this time. And when they try to say that it, in the history books, that it was Pilgrims, they're actually being deceptive. Now, in Britain, this Ceres, or Kirke, this is also where we get the name church from, in Greek, Kirke, which is Circe. She was known as the maiden, the harvest queen, the kern, or the corn baby, or the kern doll. That is something that you need to understand, the kern doll. The kern baby, or the kern doll, was made from an image of the corn, and it was dressed in clothes. And the reason I'm saying this is because once you start getting to the harvest festivals in each church, you see the corn husks dressed as little people, a woman, in clothes. This is the way they dressed up. The harvest queen would be dressed up in clothes like she was a woman, with ribbons and different multicolored clothes. And they'd also make a kern baby, or a baby doll, out of the shucks of the corn, the last shucks of those corns for that year, so that the harvest would be plentiful for the next year. And an Episcopal church started celebrating this over here, and what they would do is, over there in England too, with the Episcopal churches, that they would attach that kern baby doll to the pews. Now, when I was growing up, I'm not going to say the church that I grew up in, it was Methodist, I'll say that, but during harvest week, it always bothered me when I'd come in as a little boy, I'd see those little kern dolls, corn husk dolls, attached to the pews of the church. I thought it was witchcraft, even at that age, young age. This was before I was a teenager, and I thought that was witchcraft. Not only that, was my family, my aunt and uncle had a farm, and I respected him because he tried to honor, giving the land a rest on the Sabbath for the Shemitah year, which is also in Sukkot, the Shemitah year, honored during the last day of the festival for Sukkot. And one of the things that they would do is they would also have that little kern baby doll they would make from the corn that year, and they would tack it up in the barn so that they'd have a good harvest for the next year. And then we'd have Thanksgiving feast. And this was at the time of the harvest, Thanksgiving. So all these things revolved around Thanksgiving. Even though that day is not during the week that it was celebrated, Thanksgiving was celebrated different times of the year until Sarah Hale specifically wanted it celebrated on one day. But regardless of whether she wanted it celebrated on one day or not, the pagan influence that revolves around it is there. And one of the main things is this is a harvest Thanksgiving to Yahweh. And everybody praises Yahweh and they thank Him for the harvest on a day that is in contradiction to the day that He said to thank Him for it. This is what Jeroboam, and it was considered a sin. Who are we? Well, you may have decided Sukkot will be the time we thank You for the harvest. But, over here in America, we do it on Thanksgiving. You think He likes that? I don't think He likes it, in my opinion. So, Sukkot. What is Sukkot? Sukkot was a time, you could turn over to Leviticus 23. Sukkot was a time in Israel where they would take and have a festival for 7 days, and they would dwell in booths. And on the first day, Leviticus 23:33. When you turn there, I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to kind of skim through it and explain it. It was a pilgrimage festival. A pilgrimage festival means that they would go up as a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and that they would set apart the first day as a Sabbath, and they would go up there. Now, there's a couple of different understandings about these things that they would carry up there. And we'll be bouncing back and forth. But in verse 40, it says, on the first day you will take for yourselves ripe fruit of the tree, date palm branches, and a bushy branch of a tree, and willow branches of the wadi, and you will express great joy before Yahweh your sovereign for 7 days. 41, you will celebrate the pilgrimage festival as a festive gathering to Yahweh for 7 days in the year as an everlasting statute for your generation. In the 7th month, you will celebrate the pilgrimage festival. 42 says, you will dwell in huts or tents or booths for 7 days. Every native born in Israel will dwell in the hut or tent, so that your generations will understand that I made the children of Israel dwell in huts when I made them go out from the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh, your sovereign one. So these branches, one of the main things that they get to when you start reading rabbinical literature on Sukkot is they focus so much on these 4 species of fruit right here. And they've got this where they would, you had the etrog, I don't even know if I need to, I'm not even going to mess with the names. There's 4, there was the citron, the etrog, which was the fruit, and then you had the willow, you had a name for the willow branches, and they would take and get them bound up, and one had to be longer than the other, and they would wave them before the altar, and they would march around the altar, and they would beat them 5 times on the floor, and then at the last day that they would take the willow branches and have them bent over, there over the altar, as kind of leaning towards the altar, the same day that they also had else called the libation of water, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But they had this 326 different laws on how to build the booth and what to do with these fruits. Now, what Yahweh said is that when you present yourself, you're not to come up empty-handed. It's not that that the things that they do waving, these are offerings for like the first fruits. The first fruits was the first part of your harvest that you brought up as an offering, the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot. You set aside, during first fruits, you brought the first of the harvest, and during these 7 complete weeks, it's called the counting of the Omer. Each time you got in the crop that week, you set aside 1/10 of it. And then the next week, you set aside 1/10 of it. And you did that for those crops, and it's called the counting of the Omer. You ever wonder why Yeshua was always visiting the disciples on the first Yom Rishon, which is known as Sunday? They think most people teach that was him establishing that Sunday's the new day of rest, Sabbath. But no, he's fulfilling the feast of weeks, which is the counting of the Omer. Setting aside an offering that he was taking during Shavuot. What happened at the end of those days? Because Shavuot, first fruits and Shavuot are one complete feast called Feast of Weeks. And Shavuot was where they offered up the bread made from all that, the first fruit and the tithes, and they presented it to Yahweh with sacrifice of Shavuot. See, this is the meaning of Shavuot. This is why he was there on it to the disciples. Not that he was changing it to Sunday, but he was fulfilling the counting of the Omer. Now, what they would do is, at the end of the harvest, which is Sukkot, they would also bring an offering of that harvest. That harvest was harvesting grapes, olives, the fruits of the trees. Whenever you get the fruits of the trees, it's usually at the end of the summertime, not at the beginning of the summertime. Some at the, I think olives you can do twice a year. But most of the time, these fruit trees, the harvest was done at the end of the harvest year. And when it says they were not to come up empty-handed, they would bring these as an offering. Now in Nehemiah 8, we see that they used the olive branches and the olive shoots, and they used the willows and stuff, and they made the booths out of them, and they dwelt in those booths because Israel, when they went into captivity, because the Babylonian captivity, they rejected Yahweh and they were punished for it, they didn't celebrate these times for a very long time. And then Nehemiah and Ezra, bringing the country back together, nation back together, had them celebrate and to dwell in booths because that's what the word said. And this is what they were doing. And this is the meaning of these 4 different species. I know you got rabbinical teaching that says that they were, they focused so much on this. As a matter of fact, on the booths, so much focus is put on these booths. If you look at it, the rabbinical teaching for like I said, 326 different laws. They tell you how high to make the booth. They tell you how many sides to make the booth. They say that you can make a booth on the back of a camel, which I don't know how you live in the booth for 7 days on the back of the camel, but they've got all these different laws on what to do to make a sukkot, a booth, a sukkah. Now what is it? What does this have to do with us? What about Sukkot in the New Testament? Turn over to John chapter 7. Because there's two things that made their way into it, and I know the Shemini Atzeret, which is the last day, the 8th day, and we'll deal with that last, because that's a special day. They turned that into a separate festival, but it's part of Sukkot, and it's also separate from Sukkot. So it's kind of both. Now, what is the meaning of Sukkot? John chapter 7. It says, and after this, Yeshua was walking in Galilee, for he did not wish to walk in Yehuda because the Yehudim were seeking to kill him. The Yehudim, when John ever talks about the Yehudim, he's talking about the ruling Jews there in Jerusalem, the Pharisees and Sadducees. And the festival of the Yehudim was near, the festival of Sukkot. Now, most people take this and say, well, see, it's just a Jewish festival. No. They celebrated it there, and they had taken over that festival. And if I'm not mistaken, and the prophets, Yahweh said, I am sick of your feasts and your festivals. I am sick of them. It's not that he's sick of his festival. Those were his appointed times. Those are his festivals. But they had twisted it, and had so much added to it that they had made it their festivals and not his. His brother said to him, get away from here and go into Yehuda or Judea, so that your taught ones will also see the works you are doing. For no one acts in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. And you go through this. This is the time of Sukkot, the festival of Sukkot. And they were telling him, go up and make himself known and say, I'm the Messiah. So one of the things about Sukkot is they believed and they taught, and also the prophets, that the Messiah was coming during Sukkot. And this is when he was going to come and he was going to establish his kingdom. Yeshua is claiming to be the Messiah, and his brothers are being sarcastic and telling them going up and claiming that you're the Messiah. This you'll understand in a minute. I'll show you. This was the mindset of Jews, especially during the time of first century Israel, when Yeshua was walking on this earth as the man before he was crucified, before he was executed. Now, when you're going through there, you see that there's a something called the water libation, which was added to Sukkot. And look over in John 7, verse 36. It says, what is it? Well, skip 36, 37. Where they were talking about, they were arguing over, they didn't understand where he said that you're going to seek me, but you can't find me. But 37 says, and on the last day, the great day of the festival, Yeshua stood and cried out, saying, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me, and let him who believes in me drink, as the scripture has said, out of his innermost being shall flow rivers of living water. And this, he said concerning the Spirit, which those believing in him were about to receive, for the set apart Spirit was not yet given, because Yeshua was not yet esteemed. He was not honored. He hadn't died and rose again. Now, why is this important? Is because there's a situation that at that last great day that they had a water libation, and they do it every day. But on the last day, they had this great big old procession. That was also the day that the willows, and they would go to the pool of Siloam, and they would march this water from the pool of Siloam, which means sent, in through the water gate. That's how the name of the water gate got its name, because the water came through that gate, and they would march it around the altar, and then they would pour it out on the altar. Some said that it was symbolizing rain for that year, that they were praying for rain, but it was actually symbolizing the outpouring of the Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, onto the people, and it was pouring out, and this is the symbol for it. You see this, and it's in Isaiah. I'll read it for you. It's in Isaiah 44:3. Says, for I pour water on the thirsty, and floods on the dry ground. I pour my spirit on your seed and my blessing on your offspring, and they shall spring up among the grass like willows by streams of water. And in Isaiah 12, it talks about the living water, and you shall draw water with joy from the fountains of deliverance, which the fountains of the deliverance would be Mayim HaYeshua. So that's his name in Hebrew. So at this time, when all this was taking place, you had this great big old procession. Everybody was there, and they were watching it. The priests were there, decked out. They had all the music going on. This was being done. Yeshua stands up and cries out in a loud voice and says, if anybody's thirsty, let him come to me. The symbolism was they were wanting the Spirit poured out on them. He was saying, if you're thirsty for that, you come to me, and out of your heart will flow rivers of living water, which is Hamayim HaYeshua, those living waters of deliverance, of salvation. So it's not that he was putting his stamp on that added thing to this feast. I think he was there at the time. That was part of their tradition, and he was showing that regardless of that tradition, if you want that, you need to believe in me. Now Sukkot, there's another place that we can look at. And it's in Matthew 17. Come back to Matthew. Matthew 17, 1 through 5. Now, like I said, with what we saw, the brothers were telling Yeshua that, go up and make yourself known. They were looking for that time where the Messiah was going to come, and that it was going to be during Sukkot. Now, Matthew 17 is known as the Transfiguration. It says, and after 6 days, Yeshua took Kepha and Yaakov and Yochanan, his brother, and brought them up on the high mountain by themselves. And he was transformed before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as the light. And see, Moshe and Eliyahu, which is Elijah, appeared to them, talking with him. And Kepha answering said to Yeshua, Master, it is good for us to wish, let us make here 3 booths, which is Sukkah. And in the Greek it's Kene, which I'm going to show that in a second. One for you, one for Moshe, and one for Eliyahu. And while he was speaking, see, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice came out of the cloud saying, this is my son, the beloved, in whom I did delight. Hear him. And when they heard this, they were really afraid. You see, the mindset of all the Jews there was that the Messiah was going to come during this time and establish his kingdom. During the time of Sukkot, during these times for the festivals that they would come up to, Shavuot, Pesach, and Sukkot, Rome would have their military stationed around there because there were a lot of people there. And they were expecting the Messiah to show up, and they wanted to quell any uprising that happened. Pesach is one, Sukkot is another one. Now Sukkot, I guess I could get into this. But I believe Sukkot, the first day of Sukkot, is the time when Yeshua was born into the world. Because this is the time when Yahweh was going to come to dwell with man, and Yeshua became a man. He was born that day. And the reason I say that is when we get to the very, I'm going to say that to the end. Because we're nearing the end anyway. Turn to John 1, the very first chapter of John. John 1, 14. Cool. I get it right on the board. Sukkot. In Greek. In the Septuagint, this is the word used for Sukkah, which the plural of Sukkah is Sukkot. And in the Greek, the plural of this would be Kenai, which is feminine, which would be considered a tent, or a booth, or a hut. Whether it's made with whatever object that it's made with, whether it be skins of an animal, the tabernacle is Well, it's not called a sukkah. It's a mishkan. But the tabernacle was built with, like tents. They used, whatever they had there. They would interweave, like the willows were real fibrous, weave them together. But these are the words that are used right here. And what's interesting about the willow is, and this water about pouring out, I forgot to say, is the willow branch. The willow is the wadi. A wadi is a riverbed. It's a riverbed that overflows during rainy season. And the willows and the date palms that grow next to a wadi, they're very tenacious. The roots will sink deep, and they're very strong, trying to seek out water. And this is very important because that's what we need to do. We need to be very adamant and tenacious about seeking out the Spirit. Now, whenever it found water, the roots would just wrap around anything. Anywhere there's a willow tree, the roots would take and tear up water pipes. Some places, I think in Australia, they were trying to use them because the roots were so strong to be like water dams for washing it, to keep erosion from happening. But they were tearing up people's water lines. They consider them weeds. But anyway, a tent. Why is this important? 1 John or John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. This word right here. And we saw his esteem as the only one brought forth of the Father, complete in favor and truth. King James says he tabernacled among us. Actually, he pitched his tent. Revelation 21:3. I'm going to wrap this up. And in verse 2, I, Yochanan, saw the set-apart city, renewed Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from Elohim, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, see, the booth of Elohim, Skene. Hebrew will be Sukkah, of Elohim, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Or the booth of Elohim is with men. He shall dwell with them, and they shall be his people. And Elohim himself shall be with them and be their Elohim. The booth, Sukkah, Elohim's booth. I turn back to Revelation 7, and this is where I'm gonna focus my attention on. Revelation 7:15. On account of this, they are before the throne, the sovereign one. Throne of the sovereign one. And they render service to him day and night in his temple. And the one who is seated on the throne will pitch his tent over them. They were washed in the blood of the Lamb. They had the robes made white from the blood of the Lamb in verse 14. And in this translation it says that he will spread his tent over them. But actually it means he will pitch his tent over them. And this is what Sukkot is. Everybody gets so focused on the sukkah, the building of the booth, the making of this thing with the branches and living it in there for 7 days. And yes, he said that's what we need to do. But when you take the focus away from him and focus it on the object, then you're missing the whole point of what's going on. Why did he have, after the wandering in the wilderness, why did he say every year at Sukkot, you're to dwell in booths? There's a reason for that. In Exodus 40, (23 through 38), and I know I'm reading a lot of scripture, but it has to be put together so that you can understand exactly what Sukkot is. It says, and he raised up the courtyard all around the dwelling place and the slaughter place, which is the altar, and the place of the covering of the courtyard gate. And Moshe completed the work. And the cloud covered the tent of appointment, and the esteem of Yahweh filled the dwelling place. This is a tabernacle. And Moshe was not able to come into the tent of appointment because the cloud dwelt in it, and the esteem of Yahweh filled the dwelling place. And when the cloud was taken up from above the dwelling place, the children of Israel went onward in all their journey. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of Yahweh was on the dwelling place by day, and fire was on it by night, before the eyes of all the house of Israel in all their journeys. Now if you turn over to Numbers 9, 21, actually 20 through 23, which I'll read it for you. It says, and so it was when the cloud was above the dwelling place a few days tabernacle. According to the mouth of Yahweh they camped, and according to the mouth of Yahweh they would depart. And so it was, when the cloud dwelt only from evening until morning. When the cloud was taken up in the morning, then they departed. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud was taken up, they departed. Whether 2 days or a month or a year, that a cloud lingered above the dwelling place to dwell upon it, the children of Israel camped and did not depart. But when it was taken up, they departed. At the mouth of Yahweh they camped, and at the mouth of Yahweh they departed. They guarded the charge of Yahweh at the mouth of Yahweh by the hand of Moshe. So why were they to dwell in the booths? Why were they to dwell in Sukkot? He said, so that you can remember that when I brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, which was Mizraim, means bondage, I made them dwell in tents. And they wandered around. Why did they wander around? So that they would learn to obey everything that he said. This is why they dwell in tents. Why did he want the people to dwell in booths or tents, sukkahs? So that they would learn to obey everything that he said. So what difference does it make for us? Well, 2 Peter 1, 13 and 14, which we read this morning, me and my wife did, and it's very appropriate for this because we're talking about a tent. 2 Peter 1, 13 and 14, and I'll read it from my translation. This is Peter, or Kepha, speaking. It says, but I consider it proper, for as long as I am in this tent, skene, to wake you up with a reminder. Since after knowing the putting aside of my tent, skene, is coming soon, just as our Master Yeshua Messiah also made it clear to me. And then he goes on in verses 16 through 18, he gives about where they saw his esteem. That is, his memory of the transfiguration. Right there where they saw him transfigured, which he said, let us build booths. So what he's doing is he's using the same thing. He's considering his body a tent, skene, a booth. And we're wondering, we're not in the kingdom now. And I think Sukkot, they said it has not been fulfilled yet, but I believe that during this time, which was at the harvest, Yahweh was going to come dwell with man, and he did dwell with man, and he was born, Yeshua was born during Sukkot, because he said that if you destroy this temple, this body, which is his skene, you destroy this, in 3 days I'll raise it up. His body was his temple, where he dwelt among men. He tabernacled, where it's skene, John 1:14. All this points to where everybody was out in the field, gathered around Jerusalem. All the shepherds were, and they were staying outside in the field. How were they standing outside in the field? Because all the males had to come up to Jerusalem during that time of Sukkot and stay in booths. Now we, in this kingdom is not here yet. We're sojourners in this world. And we should stay, and I think honoring Sukkot now in our time is we should build booths. And we should live in them, knowing that this body is exactly what that is a tent. And when we stay there, we know that Israel stayed in those tents because they disobeyed him and didn't go into the land. And while they were staying in tents, wandering around for 40 years, they learned to move when he said move, and to sit when he said sit, because they followed his cloud. And with Revelation 7:15, we see that he pitched his tent over them. That is the whole image of the cloud by day, which had overshadowed all of Israel. He had Israel in his sukkah. And we are in his sukkah when he overshadows us. And we as wanderers in this world should remember that, and should remember that we need to move when he says move. We need to sit when he says sit. And we need to obey his word. And when we honor his feasts, like Sukkot and Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur and Passover, and these others, honor his appointed time. instead of doing all these holidays that we have, we see that during Sukkot in Ezekiel is when he's going to come back and he's going to establish his time here with man. Now the last day, Shemoneh Atzeret, the 8th day. That is considered a Sabbath, and it's considered a festive assembly. Atzeret, they come up with a whole bunch of names for that, but Atzeret actually means a festive assembly. So not only is it a Sabbath rest, but it's a day of great rejoicing. And that's where you see Solomon sent them to their tents in that day, rejoicing and blessing him. When the king is here during the millennial kingdom, which I think is going to happen during Sukkot, on that 8th day we're going to rejoice because we're entering into that Messianic kingdom that we're looking for. Right now we're in this sukkah, our flesh, because we're wandering around in the desert, really, in the wilderness, because we're not in that kingdom yet. We're not in that land. The kingdom is not here on earth. It's not. It hasn't been established yet. Yes, we're a part of under his rule, but we're not in the kingdom. I've heard it in seminary talking about the kingdom. Some people believe it's kingdom now, dominion theology. The Catholic Church says that they brought in the kingdom, we're in it. From what I see, if this is the kingdom, it's messed up. But we will be. And when we believed in him, put our faith and trust in Yeshua, it says that we were brought out of bondage because we were in bondage to sin. It's all about our redemption of being brought out of bondage. We're sold as slaves to sin, but we're bought at the price which was his blood. So we were brought out of that bondage, but we haven't been brought into that kingdom of come yet. We're still wandering around in this world, in our booth. But one day, when he comes back, he will pitch his tent over us and we'll dwell in his kingdom. That'll be in his kingdom. And this is what I want to do. So how should we respond to that? What do you think? Okay. Sukkot. The question was, I didn't give any dates for when Sukkot comes up, and should we honor that? How should we do that? Actually, Sukkot starts tomorrow evening at sunset. Sunday evening starts the Erev of Sukkot, which is the 27th, and the 28th, which would be that Monday, is the first day of Sukkot. That's Tishri. And that's something I forgot. The name for the 7th month is Ethanim, which means living stream. And the whole picture is living streams of water, the living streams flow from the throne. It starts September 28th through October 4th, and October 5th will be the Shemoneh or Shmini Atzeret, which will be the 8th day. How do we do it? The first day and the 8th day are considered Shabbat Sabbaton, which means a complete rest. And I think take off a day of work and rest on those days. He says, if you can, we live in a time, day and age that is not under Yahweh's kingdom authority. He's sovereign over everything, and nothing happens that he's in control of everything. But this world, he's given us free will, and this world is running according to the rule of the one that's deceiving the world. So, how should we honor it? I'll say rest on those Sabbath days, and if you want to pitch a tent outside your house, pitch a tent outside your house, read and eat, read scripture, study, spend time with your family there, and eat your supper in the tent as a sukkah. And read his word, learn to read his word and do what it says. Yes, Israel still honors Sukkot, and my wife made as the question was, does Israel still honor this? Yes, they do. My wife showed a picture of where during Sukkot, they didn't do anything. They even had law enforcement. That's something I forgot to say. Is law enforcement were sitting there at the road to keep people from driving up down the roads and riding up down the roads on their bicycles. The judges and officials that were set up in Deuteronomy 16 were set up so that they would be charged over these feasts so that people would honor them. And they were the judges. Oh yeah, they honor it by a rest and rejoicing, because it's a week of total rejoicing. So, they work during the 6 days, but during those days of Sabbath, they rest. Even the Sabbath there in Israel, as far as I know, they rest. Some of them live in booths, some of them don't. Some of them build the booths on the balconies, like what my wife said. Some of them build it on their house. Some of them build it out in the field. And I've seen pictures where there are certain places that they would have certain Messianic synagogues around Israel would go out and build sukkahs and tents up, and that's where they were at for the whole week of Sukkot. And I forgot where it's at, but I had pictures of it where they would go out there and do that and have teaching.
You were mentioning about
and the question is, what was the point, I guess, what was the point of Yeshua showing up about counting the Omer in the first of the week? And I'll teach this during first fruits and Shavuot. Shavuot means week. It's plural. It's 7 complete Sabbaths from first fruit to Shavuot, where all the males were to present themselves to Yahweh. There was a day that they were supposed to present themselves and not come up empty-handed, and the 2 loaves were offered up. But what they would do is first fruits was the first fruits that they would bring in from the crop. When they went into the land, they would sit down, and that was presented as a wave offering before Yahweh, so they accept it, and then accept the harvest, where they'd have abundant harvest. And whenever they harvest during that week, they'd start counting 7 complete weeks. And on the first day of each of those weeks, they would set aside a portion of what they gathered in. And then the next week, after that Sabbath, they'd set apart a portion. And they would do that up until it was time to go up to the temple. And they would bring that portion that they set aside up to Jerusalem. And that would be presented before Yahweh during the Feast of Shavuot. That's also the time where they would provide food for the poor and the widows. The 3rd year tithe was during this time that they would bring it up so that the storehouses would be full and that Yahweh blessed them for the land. Counting of the Omer, the reason Yeshua, in my opinion, is he fulfilled all these feasts. He was a Passover lamb. He's the sinless one, which Matzot, Feast of Unleavened Bread, resting in the grave. He's the sinless one. He was sinless. 11 Matzot, you're not supposed to have any unleavened bread. First fruits, Paul says Shaul says he's the first fruits from the dead ones. So starting at the first fruits, after that, you see his resurrection. He began to appear each first day, Yom Rishon, to the disciples. And then he goes up on that last day. He goes up, and he's veiled behind the cloud. And then they go into Jerusalem, and you see tongues of fire on their head. Spirit comes down. It's Shavuot. Everybody hears it. They hear him speaking in different languages. And that's the outpouring of the Spirit. When he went up, he took, he did fulfill the counting of the Omer, which the disciples were the first parts of the harvest, so that the harvest would be blessed. And the Spirit came down. That's counting of the Omer. That's the way I see it. First it was 10 of them because Judas killed himself. Thomas wasn't there. The second time, Thomas was there. And then, we don't see about the other times, but we do see him meeting Peter and them when they went out, for the fishing. And that's when he asked me in John 20, do you love me? He said, yeah. And he thought at that time the kingdom was going to be established, but Yeshua had to go present himself before the Father. Things had to work in the way he said it. And Moedim, which means appointed times, can also mean a rehearsal. But these appointed times of Yahweh are prophetic in everything pointing to Yeshua, pointing to his first coming and his work, and it points to his second coming. And I think Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot that we're talking about here, these three point to his second coming. Each one of these three have a different purpose. Just like he fulfilled Passover by being the lamb and being slain. He fulfilled, going into the grave. I mean, there's a certain function that he fulfilled in these set apart times, these appointed times, plus first fruits and Shavuot. It's not like it's all about him. Everything's about him. And that's why I believe that Yom Teruah is us being called up to the marriage supper, because it talks about the marriage supper and he gives all the parables about the marriage, the wedding garment, and everything. And then Yom Kippur is a picture of the high priest coming out from behind the veil, showing that redemption has been purchased and you're redeemed. But the whole thing about Hebrews is him being our high priest. Sukkot is about him dwelling with man and us entering into that rejoicing state. And you see that in Revelation, where it's always he's going to pitch his tent, he's going to pitch his tent. Sukkot. So I think these next three have fulfillment in the marriage, redemption, and dwelling.
Why are we keeping like Thanksgiving next Friday, November 20-something, and early March and September? Why do you see a connection between those two?
Why do I see it? The question was, why am I picking on Thanksgiving? Why do I see a connection between, because Thanksgiving is not even here yet, and we're dealing with Sukkot. The reason I see a connection here and the reason I'm picking on Thanksgiving is because everything about Thanksgiving, the traditions there with the horn of plenty, cornucopia, it's pagan. It's set up as a thanksgiving to Yahweh for a harvest, a bountiful harvest, but a lot of the stuff like the kern doll that I remember growing up seeing that done in churches. You see harvest sales are started now. They're already decorating the churches where our daughter Chrissy goes to school, at a Christian school. They meet in a church and it's already got the little corn husk dolls out there decked out in the ribbons and the multicolored stuff and set up for that. And harvest season has started. And everything's pointing to Thanksgiving and they're ignoring Sukkot. Very few people know anything about Sukkot or even celebrate Sukkot. But Thanksgiving is what they focus on, and they consider that a day of thanking Yahweh for the harvest, which he's already set up a time for that. Jeroboam tried to set up his own time for it. And when Thanksgiving has all the connotations of paganism, and it wasn't always celebrated on the fourth Thursday. It was celebrated during the time of Sukkot. And it was pagan. And it was a harvest. But this Sarah Hale wanted it on that day. And it doesn't matter whether it's on that day or not. Everything about it is pagan. She just put it to another day. And still, just like Jeroboam put Sukkot to another day, she's done the same thing. And that's what American Congress did is, well, this will be the day that we give thanks. When Yahweh said, here's the day that you give me thanks.
Well, I think when you show the new covenant, and we don't really have to bother ourselves with all this Old Testament stuff.
Okay, the question is, isn't Yeshua the new covenant? We don't have to bother with all this stuff anymore. Well, Yeshua said that I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it or to proclaim it completely. Shaul says that the Messiah is not, they said it is the end of the law, but actually the word is teleos, which means he is the completion or he's the goal of the Torah. And that's the way it should be read. Not that he's the end of the law, but he's the goal of the Torah. Teleos means goal, like you run into a finish line, you get there, you've completed it, and there's the goal. And that's why the scripture is all about him. He didn't destroy the Torah, he lived the Torah, and he taught that you're to obey the Torah. 1 John 5:3, and this is love for Yahweh. You obey his commands. Yeshua says all throughout the Gospels, if you love me, you keep my commands. If you love me, keep my commands. On this, loving Yahweh with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and loving your neighbor as yourself, hang the prophets and the Torah. Which means if you're doing those two, then you're fulfilling the others. But it doesn't. He didn't say that you need to just do these two and forget the others. He said that if you're doing these two, you're going to fulfill the others because, one, you're going to love him and you're going to do what he says. You're going to love your neighbor. You're not going to sleep with your neighbor's wife. You're not going to covet their stuff. So no, he's not the, just because he came and died and rose again doesn't mean that the Torah ended. He fulfilled what the Torah said about him for the redemption of man is what the completion is. But Yahweh gave us his Torah so that we would be set apart from the world. And how do you know who's set apart? Those who are obeying his word. Honestly, you can't tell the church any difference between the church and the world today. The people that are being Torah observant, you can tell there's a difference there, and they make people angry because they have set themselves apart to obey the word. So no, he didn't destroy it or complete it.
I mentioned something about Easter and Christmas too. I'm wondering, is there anything out there that I can research that for myself so that I can better understand what's taken about Easter and Christmas?
And the question is, I mentioned Christmas and Easter about being pagan, and I just went on from there. And is there anywhere that I can go to learn more about it for myself? Yes, the reason I mentioned it is because Christmas and Easter are pagan, and that's a whole teaching within itself that I'll deal with when I deal with Easter, and when winter solstice comes up, I'll deal with it then. But 119 Ministries, be careful of some of the stuff they say. They have a good teaching on, it's called Sunburned. And there's many places on the internet. I think Sunburn is probably the best teaching I've seen that deals with the pagan influence of Christmas and Easter. And I've got a teaching myself on my YouTube channel about Easter and its pagan influence. So if you look up Chuck Black on YouTube, Chuck Black and Easter, yeah. I think it's an older teaching than I have, but it's on Easter.
What are the main takeaways you would like us to have about, say, you had to wrap it up in like paragraphs? What do you want us to get out of this teaching like that? And why does it have so many names?
Okay. If I had to wrap it up in one paragraph of what to take away about Sukkot, in one paragraph. I guess the question would be, what does this mean for us? I think it means for us is that Peter considered himself living in a tent, this body as a tent, which is a sukkah, a skene, which means we're dwelling in this world. We've been released from bondage. We're in this world, but we're dwelling in a booth. We see that in Scripture. We've been released from bondage. We're dwelling in this world in a sukkah. And we should, I think, celebrate this day knowing that Israel wandered around because of disobedience. And they wandered around for 40 years dwelling in tents to learn obedience. So as we're in this sukkah ourselves and walking around in this world, during this time of Sukkot, I think we should dwell in the booths knowing that when we're disobedient, you wander around in the desert. And we need to learn to obey him and obey his word because his kingdom is coming. And I want to go into the land. I don't want to wander around in the desert and die. So I would say in one paragraph, Sukkot, honor it, knowing that it meant that we are to learn to obey him and to guard his word instead of focusing on what type of booth we should have and what type of fruits we need to bring. Because we can't go up to Jerusalem, there's no temple there, there's no altar there, so we can't do the sacrifices and bring our offerings there. But we can spend time in a booth learning to follow and obey him. Does that answer it? Yes. Yes, that's exactly what I was going to do. All right, let's pray. We're going to close in prayer. Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for this wonderful time that you've given us today to learn about Sukkot and understand how much we have missed by following these holidays and these traditions of men. I just pray that this message will cause people, whether they agree with me or not, that if they disagree, that they may do more checking into it and seek out understanding of your word and understanding of what is there. Father, you have called us to read your word and do what it says, and that is my prayer. May this message be a blessing to everyone who hears it. and may we learn obedience as we're wandering in this world, waiting for your kingdom to come and for us to dwell in your Sukkot as you pitch your tent over us. We love you, we praise you, we ask this in Yeshua's name. Amen.